Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Dr. Saudi Garcia. I am a program director with Scholars for Social Justice, and I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming you all to this panel, Universities as Political Battlegrounds, a Call for Courage. We named this panel after our zine that we produced earlier this year, and I want to read a bit from it as a way to set the stage for our conversation today. We're witnessing a brazen frontal assault on higher education by a right-wing authoritarian regime that seeks to control what faculty write, speak, and teach, as well as who is allowed and has access to our classrooms. As teachers, students, researchers, and campus workers, we must muster the collective courage to resist. And so here we are for the National Day of Action for Higher Education, mustering the courage to resist, forming community, and creating pathways to our collective liberation. Sharing the zine here in the chat for everybody. And so today we will hear from very, very esteemed panelists, members of Scholars in Social Justice, and we also have Tanjiwa McHarris, who is the Executive Director of Scholars for Social Justice here. We want to say thank you to Mariah Quinn at AAUP for helping us organize this webinar, and to the entire team behind A Day of Action for Higher Education, which has been galvanizing us across the country with more than 200 events and thousands of people mobilized. So I want to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Dr. Deo F. Gore, who is an associate professor in the Department of African American Studies at Georgetown University. She arrived at Georgetown from the Department of Ethnic Studies and Critical Gender Studies at the University of California, San Diego, where she served as a chair of ethnic studies and a founding director of the Black Studies Project, a collaborative research center. Professor Gore is the author of Radicalism at the Crossroads, African-American Women Activists in the Cold War, and the co-editor of Want to Start a Revolution, Radical Woman in Black Freedom Struggle. We also have Megan Ibarra with us today. Dr. Ibarra joined UC San Diego in 2024 as an associate professor of designing just futures in the communication department after 10 years as a professor in geography at UW Seattle. She has shared her research in English and Spanish through books, zines, documentary, and podcasts on environmental justice, Latin migrations, and abolition geography. Her current projects are a book under contract called The Aroma of Tacoma, Radical Placemaking for Abolition and Environmental Justice, and producer of From the Inside Out with host Ralph Dunois, who is incarcerated at the Washington Corrections Center. So without further ado, I want to say welcome to you all.
Recording in progress.
Welcome to our panelists, and that we will be recording this event. And so the first round of questions for Dr. Gore and Dr. Ibarra are the following. Universities are political battlegrounds. This is not new, but it is intensifying. Can you help us understand why the university is such a critical site of struggle at this moment?
I assume that I'll start that out, Saudi. First, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Saudi and Tanjiwe and the folks through organizing the National Day of Action for putting this on. It's great to see so many people mobilized and engaged and having conversations. So I hope this will be a part of the conversation. I am really pleased to be here in part because I am very active in SSJ, but also I love the title, Call for Courage. And I think that really speaks to the moment we're in. Based on my work, it is something I'm interested in, how people survived the Cold War, sort of how Black women mobilized during the Cold War, anti-communism. And I think it provides some models for us today for building resistance in this moment. And I also think it really speaks to this need for us to have courage. I love that as a title, because in some ways, we need the courage not only for resistance, but I think to begin to think more boldly about how we put forth an alternative vision of the university, one that really speaks truth to power, that thinks about challenging the structures of white supremacy and racial capitalism, that thinks about a greater mission of sort of creating the university as a site for social justice, not just extraction and money making. So I think that call for courage is twofold, both call for courage to take up resistance, but also call for courage to start to articulate and collectively build a better vision for the university. And I would say in part why this moment is so important is in such a central site now is because it's not new. And this moment where we find ourselves under attack is built upon previous moments of attack. I think in part, we have to really acknowledge the ways in which the assaults we're facing now at the university are built on assaults that have other communities have faced as have gone along. Thinking about the ways in which the war on terror and the criminalization of immigration and the use of sort of the authorization of the surveillance state that really took hold in the US post 9/11 is part of what we're facing at the university now with the calls for surveilling our students, and particularly international students, that I think is, is clearly on the road to surveilling us all. We're in that process now. And I think, you know, when you talk to faculty, they really feel that, wondering, do I need to change the titles of my courses now? Am I gonna, is there a way that I can sort of escape sort of the surveillance eye? And I think partly one of that is that these things have been happening in other places, and now they're coming sort of into the university. The other framework I think that we are having to fight that has been long existing is structures of white supremacy. And we see them in our university all the time, even in the midst of DEI. I think we could, there have been well honed critiques of DEI as a sort of a more of an appeasement than an effort to sort of challenge social inequality. And part of that is now being taken up as an attack on DEI, which, you know, makes it difficult to defend something that was doing so little in the first place, but also in the name of explicitly, I think, an idea of who should be in the university and who the university should be operating for. And it's not Black and brown people, it's not immigrants, it's not women, it's not LGBTQ or trans folks, right? That they somehow have snuck in and destroyed the university. And I think that our inability to challenge that as it's been an ongoing part of the university really makes it hard to articulate a critique of what's happening other than to say it's white supremacy, right? But in part, what we know is that the university is not run by those folks on the margin, right? And I listened to a great talk by Kathy Cohen yesterday that outlined that. And we also know that DEI rarely did much to buttress that change that, right, to shift the structures of power. But again, we're left here struggling against that, and I think partly it calls us to make it clear that unless we challenge that structures of white supremacy, it will always be an entry point for attack at the university, right? And for divisiveness and challenges. And I think we can talk more about the ways in which anti-Semitism has been mobilized against that, that I think falls into this larger framework of the university not being explicit as its efforts to think about social equality, racial equality, and the real ways that has operated in the US. And then the last thing I think is that we haven't been good about challenging is the ways in which the university increasingly has been not an effort to, particularly for state universities, to, as many of their missions, land grant missions state, to educate the populations, to educate their community, but has been really a site of extractive politics, where racial capitalism, I think in the past period has fueled neoliberalism, how it continues to fuel a sort of capitalist model instead of idea of a service model that I think speaks to its non-for-profit standards, the land grant missions. We can think about the ways in which that rhetoric is there, even if the practice is not, and increasingly how it's become a site for control, for elite hedge fund, business, corporations, administrative forces, so forth. So I think because we have not articulated a strong, we haven't won the fight against those forces, they're now coming back. They're still ongoing and they're being utilized by, I think, a more authoritarian force, a state power in that moment. So one, I think that's a long way of saying, I think part of why this is so important is because they're longstanding fights. There have been fights in the university that we've had to really take a stand on for a long time, and they continue to be sites of struggle. Two, I think, so that's my one reason I think this moment is important now. The second thing I would say is that, borrowing really from DeVary and Baldwin, the university does so much more than simply teach students, right? Or support research, or give professors a place to work, or they are now sort of some of the higher employees of certain regions and cities. They are major property owners, real estate owners. They are the central hospital, both as research hospitals, but also just healthcare providers in the neighborhood. I think about sort of my place at Georgetown and how it plays such a central role in DC. As all those things, right? It's also a major employer for folks. And increasingly, I think a site for how we think about the US engagement with the world, right? So the ways in which the universities sort of those functions have also been expanded beyond the US border. Think about how many universities now have outposts other places and expanding. So I recommend DeVary Baldwin's work on the university as a powerful model for thinking about the university as more than just the place for that. And so I say that to say, I don't think the project that we're fighting against now that's coming down is a project about sort of doing away with the university. I think it's a project of claiming and sort of controlling the university and all of those aspects of it that are much more expansive than just where it's starting now. Who is in the classroom, who teaches the students what they learn. That's important, but I think it expands beyond that. And then the third thing I would say is why this is an important moment is that in part, it's why I became, I went to university also, I like my summers off, but to be more focused, it's the work we do. And I don't mean, I'm a historian, so I'm not curing cancer. I'm not dealing with living people most of the time, right? But I think my work is important in the part for the ways in which it at times engages popular education, at times builds connections with communities. I think at its best we do that work, not in an exploitative way, but in a sort of collaborative way. And I think at our best, in particularly humanities and social sciences, we teach people to think critically, and we produce knowledge often from that really in the most marginalized ways marginalized knowledge that doesn't get often get the light of day in other places. And I think our strategies we bring an important sort of voice to validating and disseminating sort of rigorous knowledge production. And we can talk about the complications of that. But I think for me, I think about the importance of creating space for marginalized knowledges and interventions. And I think about something like abolition as one of the really powerful ways we can see the work we're doing and the work that happens in the university as a work that's collaborative with our communities, but also disseminates an ideology an idea of thinking about the state, right, that was not dominant 20 years ago, I think was, on the margins, but has become through people's research and scholarship, and particularly that research and scholarship engaging with communities and building knowledge with communities, not solely from the communities and not sharing it, giving it to communities, but with in collaboration, that has been a very powerful model for what the best of what we could do, right? To have people think differently about the carceral state in very real ways. And I would say that in part, that success of things like abolition studies, critical abolition studies, the ways we might think about the state violence and state police power differently and the carceral state differently, is part of also why we find ourselves under attack. The success of that, the ability of that, the power of that work we do, I think, it's clearly what the attack on wokeness in some parts is this call for weeding out certain perspectives in the university is trying to challenge. And I would say that is a part also of the long history of many departments in the university, particularly those Black studies, African American studies, women and gender studies, LGBT studies that emerge out of social movements and communities and still carry that forth. And so I think that is what I would say is another key part of that, the work we do. And we have to be much better at articulating why that matters, what that means for the students we work with, not just at elite universities, but the majority of our universities, where it allows students to feel, to hone their skills as thinkers, right? To find a place to have conversations around these, to build sort of a broader importance of sort of the intellectual work we do to challenge sort of the anti-intellectualism that I think has been longstanding in the U.S. Um, in the U.S. more broadly. And so I would say that we're not curing cancer, but I was still a framework from Kathy Cohen, and then Julie knows what I was saying. I thought that she's like, we're curing the cancer of white supremacy. You could put in whatever you want. We're curing the cancer of imperialism, of social inequities. And so maybe I'll stop there. I don't want to go over too long with my time, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Deo. Appreciate it. Megan, again, the question is, universities as political battlegrounds, this is intensifying. Can you help us understand why the university is such a critical site of struggle in this moment?
Yeah, thank you so much. And Deo, I really appreciate your comments and lifting up Devarian Baldwin's work. I mean, I think I appreciate his dedication to the AAUP, who's helped put together this action for us, but also the ways in which he critiques universities as essentially glorified real estate investment trusts. Together with that call, as a geographer, I always think about the ways in which we can take back those spaces and engage in radical placemaking that repurposes universities away from the wishes of major donors and towards the will of people and community. So I'm really grateful to the organizers for the opportunity to share and reflect with you all. I can see there's folks that I've worked with before who are here and folks whose work I teach. So it's a real honor. I wanted to both like name the longer history of universities, maybe a truncated version, and then talk a little bit about our contemporary moment. I'm reminded that the Davis Putter Scholarship Fund for Radical Organizers, which I currently co-chair, was actually founded by folks who were pushed out of universities during the era of McCarthyism. So these entanglements of race, immigration, and political commitment that are framed as being anti-American have long played out in universities. And let's be clear, when the federal government forced desegregation, many cities did things like choosing to close municipal swimming pools rather than desegregate. Universities, however, remained open and became sites where candidates, who were often twice as qualified, continued the struggle to attain more than half the access and recognition, which continues to this day. I'm really proud to have worked at public universities for 16 years now. I did the math. At UC Berkeley, the University of Washington, and now UC San Diego. I want to make it clear that I do not work for my chair. I do not work for the chancellor. I don't even work for the students. I work for Californians across all histories of criminal punishment, all immigration statuses. And my role is to help them build the skills and access the resources they deserve to analyze their world and then change it for the better. And sometimes the first step is just like helping them get through the door and get access to the education that they deserve as Californians. I want to pivot and just talk about how I understand our current moment and the ways in which it was deeply predictable for those who saw it coming. By which I mean, in recent years, there have been some blatant stress tests by right-wing folks on academic integrity that many universities have frankly failed. I mean, Columbia is honestly just the latest example. I'll talk about my personal experience. So 3 crucial moments where leadership in my former workplace, University of Washington, failed. In 2017, during the first Trump administration, the University of Washington hosted a right-wing speaker who regularly endorsed violence for patriarchy, for white supremacy, called out people who should be bullied and or receive violence on campus speaking. And leadership did nothing to address the precedent of clear threats of violence. They said, like, the antidote for calling for violence is good speech, which is, there's a real difference between comfort and safety, right? Comfort is, I don't like the way that you ask me to respect your pronouns. And safety is, I am going to kill you. Those are two very different things that too often liberal administrators have collapsed. So in this case, I canceled class. I asked my folks to stay home. UW paid millions of dollars in overtime to cops who did what cops do. They showed up in all their fancy SWAT gear. They charged us a lot of money, and they watched in silence as white supremacists shot someone, almost killing him. And the university's response was essentially nothing, and it continued to collapse comfort and safety. In 2022, the University of Washington leadership decided to, after having accepted a donation of $5 million that required leveraging state funding to establish an Israel Studies program, a major donor objected to the way that the Israel Studies program was carried out because it acknowledged the existence of Palestine. Now, this was in no way included in any of the paperwork. The university had no legal obligation to return the money, but they did so anyway. Adding insult to injury, this meant that the state, Washington State, picked up this tab and backfilled to subsidize the Israel Studies program. The major donor then turned and gave that money to Turning Point USA, which sort of laid the very clear funding background for attacking student, staff, and faculty who spoke up for academic freedom. In 2024, I spoke at a rally on the Quad to say two very basic things that I stand by. One, students who exercise their right to speech should not be subjected to doxing and death threats. And two, genocide is bad. So it was October 2024. Some of those students who had received doxing and death threats and feared for their lives, they were anti-Zionist Jews who were called anti-Semitic because of their moral and political stance against genocide in Palestine. I was then subjected to doxing, death threats, and an off-the-books investigation of my teaching that was in violation of the faculty code and state regulations. There was a student who asserted that I made them feel unsafe in class because I showed a map of Palestine. The process showed that the student's discomfort was not affecting their ability to learn, but university leadership decided to run an off-the-books investigation on me anyway. It's part of the reason why I left. Faculty, administrators, and community members who wanted to tone police advocacy instead of question genocide sent a clear message to the right wing. They will not fight back. Now, one of the most important ways to understand that universities are important is the amount of money and time and energy that folks on the hard right, white supremacists, racial capitalists, and folks who have their gender ideology in which they want to impose a particular idea of gender and marriage and citizenship upon all the rest of us. They understand that the universities are important. So we have to understand that they are too. One of the things that was really hard for me over that last year was the number of people who believed that because they didn't have a political opinion, that what was happening to our students, staff, and faculty didn't affect them. This has been going on for years, right? But in 2025, it's now become clear to those of us who have a relationship to Medicaid, to Social Security, to universities. Many people, particularly university researchers, who thought that their work was not political, are discovering what many of us have always known because of our identities. Our existence is political. So it's time for us to really take up the university as a site of struggle because it's already been made a site of struggle by the far right wing. And we need to think about why it is that it has this power. The power to cure cancer is really cool, but that's not the only thing that universities have to offer, right? Universities are sites for research. They're also sites for learning. They're also sites for academic speech. And they're important sites for community where many of us have come together to question the status quo and enact a prefigurative politics that allows us to imagine community otherwise. So it's a really important time for us to take up that call to courage. Thanks.
Thank you so much for those comments, Megan. We really appreciate them. And also appreciate your courage in speaking out about some of the things that happened and giving specifics and details. It's very much appreciated and supportive to people who might have experienced those things themselves and have not been able to speak about them. We actually have Davarian Baldwin here with us today. Um, and so we want to invite Dr. Baldwin to speak and share a few words. It's not every single day that you get to have the person being referenced in the panel. So yeah, we would love for Davarian to share a few words.
Hey, thanks so much, Saudi, and thanks Dale and Megan and Tunjiwe and everyone who's on the call. I mean, the reason why I'm here is because this is my community. I'm not anybody special here. These are my people, my comrades, and I'm proud to stand with SSJ, leading the fight for our own liberation within this higher ed space, but hopefully and beyond. I mean, they have laid out the substance of the stakes already, so I just want to talk to the spirit, just really briefly. From a general perspective, what's at stake? Everything's at stake. As people were saying before, like, this discussion around democracy and higher education, how it's been hijacked by, university presidents like Ron Daniels in his book. He's on the book tour. And I sat with him on a stage, and he talked about the things that presidents always talk about, higher education as a pathway to career development, higher education as a path to raising your wages over your lifetime. And those are the typical things that we talk about, but that misses the point entirely, especially at an institution like Johns Hopkins that stands as the biggest landholder in East Baltimore, the low-wage employer. Black and brown folks work on that campus more than they work anywhere else in the city at poverty wages. They're still eligible for public assistance, even though they work full-time at Hopkins, this multi-million-dollar institution, so-called best medical facilities in the world. And yet the health disparities in East Baltimore are at an all-time low. How can you be number one in the world and yet you live amidst the health disparities of East Baltimore in the way that you do? So, I mean, it just points out to me that the struggle for democracy is a struggle for higher education. And it's not just about, and I'm a member of AAUP, as Megan pointed out, and also was with Davis Putter for some years. The higher ed labor discussion is changing now, but for too long, the discussion has just been about our own myopic interests, shared governance and free speech. And that's effective in our walls, but we've been put on the front lines. We have been understood as what's wrong with America. And we've done a horrible job of translating precisely what we do in America. And so we get caricatured as just simply a group of tenured radicals and spoiled brats. And then we sit there and talk about shared governance and academic freedom. And like, Exhibit A. we need to be on the front and say that higher ed labor is American labor. Higher ed housing insecurity is American housing insecurity. Healthcare disparity in higher education is American or global healthcare disparity. That because universities and their medical centers sit at the center of our economy, basic bread and butter issues around health, land, labor, policing, wealth, housing, all circle around these institutions as the major player in these sectors. So to just simply have a discussion about shared governance and academic freedom, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. And we also need to have a bigger brand and bigger vision of abolition. I understand the arguments that our institutions were rooted in settler colonialism and slavery, and we want to burn them all down. I get that sentiment. But our enemies are saying, yeah, burn it, say that, burn it down, because they understand all of the wealth, all of the power that is consolidated on our campus grounds. They want us to turn our back on these institutions. They want us to feel ambivalent. But instead, we should claim, as Dale and Megan said before, ownership. Every institution of higher learning in this country is brought into existence by a state charter, public or private. Now, the private schools will tell you, no, we are autonomous, but they're not. In principle, we could actually revoke their state charter. That's what brings them into existence. So because that, their job is to serve these states and the citizens within. So when they bring in more international students, they're not saying anything's wrong with that. or students outside of the state to get greater tuition and increase student debt, they're actually betraying their state charter. When they move into our communities and raise up housing values and spur gentrification, they are betraying their so-called social mission. These institutions are ours. And we have a precedent of understanding what that can mean. This is the reason why when Trump and Rufo and DeSantis attacked higher ed in Florida, the first thing they attacked was Black studies, Black queer studies, Black feminist studies. Why? Because of the origins of those formations, they understood the both intellectual and material power of higher education. Black studies at its origins wasn't just about diversifying curriculum and faculty. They understood in the 1950s and 60s how higher education was already moving to the center of land control, was already moving to the center of low-wage labor. And they were fighting against that. And that's what our enemies know, that we are ambivalent to claim. We have the vision and the knowledge within us, but we're playing defense and on the back foot. We need to claim, own, clarify, document, articulate our stated right to these institutions as serving liberatory possibilities. Are they perfect? Hell no. Are they the answer? No. But from a materialist perspective, if these institutions are going to consolidate so much power and resources in our daily lives that have nothing to do with teaching classes and conducting pure research, we need to own that shit. We need to claim it and reorient it in ways that are liberatory for our true public good. So I'm going to stop that.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic and really really has everyone really fired up. The vision is clear. And actually this leads so well into our second question, which we're only going to have about 10 minutes to address. This 2-person panel just became a 3-person panel, which is what are the strategies that we could be deploying at this moment? What are the ways that we could be actualizing some of this that we're discussing? What are the offensive strategies that we could be putting into action to build power? So I will, open it up for any 3 of you to speak as you will. And we want to have about 10 minutes left at the end for Q&A from our audience. So feel free, any of you who want to jump in.
I could go real quick and get it started. So Devarian, yeah, thanks for showing up and speaking with us. I really appreciate that. I think, for me, one of the things that I wanted to also lift up that has been really useful in my own learning is an article that I just linked to in the chat by High Country News that's called Land Grab Universities. So they've been tracking how do we think about where the land that universities come from. They also have been tracking universities' compliance or lack thereof with things like NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Repatriations Act. And the goal is not to burn it all down, but to recognize that land that is stolen comes with an obligation. And I particularly am on and part of a land grab land grab state system, which means that we have a real obligation, a responsibility, and an opportunity to take these kinds of universities and move them away from elite spaces and really ground ourselves in the land that we all live on. And think about how to come into right relations with the land. I always hit these kinds of tensions because folks always want to talk about climate change in environmental justice. And one of the things that I have learned from my participation in American Indian studies and Indigenous studies more broadly is that, like, when we take that 200-year truncated view on the Industrial Revolution, we're missing those 500 years of settler colonialism and the ways in which we have come out of right relation with the land in the first place. We got to have that really, really long-term view. Universities thinking about where the land is that we're on and what those opportunities bring is one way that we can do it. I also want to really push us to move to think about how do we do our work. Abolition often gets stuck in this, like, I'm either with or against. And for me, when we think about this kind of work, we got to work within, against, and beyond the state. As I mentioned, my co-host, or in the introduction, I mentioned that I was a producer and co-host for a podcast called From the Inside Out. That is with somebody who's currently incarcerated. And that is not a person who walks away from state legislation and abolitionist reforms, because that is how he can get free. But he also doesn't believe that the state's going to free him. So I have learned from people who experience state violence most directly that whether you work within, against, or beyond the state is a question of strategy and power mapping, right? We need to, instead of just have this one way of doing things and one way of engaging, to think, who's in power, who can I move, and how do I make that happen? And that is the way in which we need to sharpen our analysis. And as Devarian says, come forth with a public strategy that people can understand and relate to.
Thank you so much, Megan. Other thoughts? What are some of the strategies we could be using today to build power?
Yes, I'll jump in and thank you, Megan, for that framing of this question, and Devarian for your contributions to the panel. Welcome to the panel. It's good to see you. I guess I will just think about, I think organizing, we have to organize our way to resistance in this and to envisioning and putting in practice a different vision of the university. And I think that organizing has to be both locally based, but also have a national resonance. I think we have to be able to do both. We have to be able to, be able to, and when I mean, say, local organizing, I don't just mean in your university. Yes, that's important. AAUP chapters, if you're doing faculty for Justice of Palestine, whatever, debt collectors, whatever local thing that might be happening in your university, absolutely. But the university is embedded in a community. And I think we have to be so much better at engaging our communities. And we can do that in so many ways. I don't mean community service programs. I mean going out and being able to talk to people about the work we do and how important, how they understand the work we do, how we can be sort of good citizens in the community, or contribute to building the community, or giving up some of the access we have and the resources we have in the university as well. And I think some of that, if you go back to the history, I love Darren's mentioning of the history of programs like Black Studies, Gender Studies, LGBT studies, that emerge often from community organizing, demanding a place at the table in the university. And we, I think, have to facilitate that conversation continuing, and those resources being more accessible. And that may mean things like building local community spaces so people can have access to some of the resources and the knowledge production that's happening in the university. That may mean, as people are doing inside-outside programs, there are spaces for that exist. And that may mean just being able to talk to people in your community about why the university matters, how we make it more accessible, how we actually meet the needs of the services the university so often claims it's providing, right? Part of what the university does is make a really profound argument that they're not extracting from the community, they're providing to it. And we have to, I think, in some places, make that in our local organizing, make them accountable to that practice. So that's the one thing. But I think on a national level, there is a conversation happening now, and there needs to be a different voice, I think, about what the university does. I think the visions put out by the leadership, and we see I can't read another op-ed in the New York Times that tries to frame itself as resistance by reproducing the same sort of frameworks that I think Devarian mentioned some of them. It's about job training. It's about, being neutral parties in the democracy or something, or the critiques of creating safe spaces for folks with no discussion of what safety looks like. In these places. And so I think in part, we need to have a real conversation at the national level that produces a real alternative vision for the university and is honest about what the university has been doing. I just will say it is unbelievably frustrating to me to hear Megan talk about her experiences on campus, to know what it is to be a Black faculty and a queer faculty on campus, and then to suddenly see the state so invested in creating safety for students. After I have witnessed many students feeling unsafe, when I was at UC San Diego, they had white nationalists come into our campus with fake ICE badges. And what did the university say? It fell back on this idea of free speech, right? And so it is so hypocritical what is happening now in that framework. And I think it does feed into the earlier frameworks of the structures of white supremacy that we have to address. And so I do believe we have to have a national voice about this that challenges that place in the university, that thinks more complexly, not about freedom of speech, because it's not a sort of what in a state, a country built on white supremacy. Freedom of speech is a much more complex thing than everyone gets the right to speak. We have to be able to talk about the ways in which racial capitalism fuels that, white supremacy fuels that, and inequalities and access to power fuel that, and make it a much more complex issue than that. And that we have to think seriously about what safety means, right? We should have safety on campuses, but safety is not about your ideas being challenged or you having to confront sort of unequal power, right? I think Megan's point around sort of the experiences people have around violence and how that goes so unnoted is really important to point out. So that was a little longer than my 5 minutes maybe, but I'll stop there.
There's not much left to say. I'll just add that on the ground strategies for me can be summed up as the fact that we have to have a positive approach, an active approach to building the university that we want to see, not waiting. Like some people, I was like, and again, you've already pointed out, Dale, like how DEI was never what we wanted it to be. We've made it into some things that it wasn't intended to be. But on the other extreme, when DEI was going out the door, and people like, oh my God, what are we going to do? And my vision, maybe I'm just an old curmudgeon, but I'm like, if your whole policy was predicated on DEI, and now you're talking about what we're going to do, then you didn't have no policy in the first place. And what I say by that, what I mean by that, is that we are the power that we've been waiting for. And the perfect example of that to me was the encampments, which are rooted in earlier takeovers of campuses from the 1960s and the 80s, where I went to encampments all over the country. I saw some amazing things. And I was also a part of, community-based actions against places like Yale and Hopkins and Berkeley and University of Miami, where I looked around at the protest and there was kids, there were students doing face painting on children, there was food giveaways, there was clothing giveaways, there was teach-ins, there were professors being brought to the encampments to teach, there was solar-powered medical tents and washing stations, there was interpersonal safety networks, and I looked around, there was music playing with DJs and dancing. I looked around and said, shit, this is the university we're waiting for. Why are we pointing to the spires to say, will you give us the answer? We are the answer. And so the point that I'm making is that instead of, we should make demands on these institutions because they have our resources. But while we wait for them to ever, never answer, we need to be building out the university and the spaces of commoning and collective collaboration that we seek, so that when people in the world are looking for solutions and answers, because there are many people that are maybe not being on this call, they're going to be caught up in the bulldozer of this current crisis. And they're going to be looking for different alternatives and solutions. And we need to be that solution of mutual aid, of solar-powered medical tents, of robust education, of community-led development, of anti-eviction campaigns, of community health projects. We need to start building these things now, stealing food from cafeterias that get thrown away every day and converting into healthy meals for communities in need. We need to be, if the university is going to consolidate all this power, and I'm talking about we need to take it back, we need to start doing things with this power, with these resources, with the paper and the copy machines and the food and the spaces and the knowledge. These are the things that we can be doing right now that are not predicated on waiting for the institution to say they're going to give us a new DEI program. Just a short plug, SSJ has a new vision called ARIS, Abolition, Reparations, Investment in Safety. That's a vision. And it comes from not simply saying, this is a dangerous move to say that we're going to defend higher education. We've been catching hell in higher ed. So what are we defending? The vision is not defend higher education. The vision is to advance it to become something that it never wanted to be, but it will be required to be if we're going to stay in these spaces. And that's what I see.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. We have a few more moments for questions. So let's see if we have any questions from our audience. If not, then we'll begin closing out.
Recording stopped.
We have a closeout question for you all. Just one sentence. What to you does it mean to be courageous in this moment? That was our last question. Oh, we have a question from the audience. You can be unmuted and ask your question.
Okay, thanks. Hi, my name's Paul. I am a grad worker from NC State University and a rank and file member from the Workers Union UE Local 150, which covers all of the UNC school system. Now that the question I have is more, I guess, strategy based. Trying to hear from the panelists, what are some, I guess I'm more like, what are some things that you're currently doing that because that concretely protects our international college students? Something that we're currently doing, I'm glad that's not recorded, is identifying stores and restaurants across from the university that's willing to shelter if something bad happens. And also with the international students, summer is coming up, that might not be a bad idea to see if faculty or even students or staff would be willing to offer housing, even a couch, if they can't go overseas. Some of the thoughts I want to share out there. Just wondering, if any one of you have implemented similar strategies right now as we go forward with protecting international students from the harm that the Trump administration is doing.
Thank you so much. So I'm hearing any mutual aid strategies, supportive strategies for international students who are being actively hunted down by this administration.
Yeah, and let me do you want to go first, Dale?
No, I was just gonna say, well, let me just, I guess that's a yes. Let me just say this. I really encourage folks to take advantage of a lot of the resources that are already happening, that are doing sort of bystander trainings, know your rights trainings, sanctuary cities, sanctuary schools activities. So there are lots of resources out there that you can tap into, because I think individual campuses are trying to think about these issues, and there are more broader national resources for that work. That's all, but I'll turn it to Megan.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I want to just make sure that I reframe it to point out that at many universities we are going to have faculty, we're going to have staff, we're going to have graduate students, undergraduate students, and many of us are going to have workers, whether it's from the cafeteria all the way through medical centers, that have immigrants. So the University of Washington right now has their first employee who's sitting in a detention center. And that, rank and file union are showing up for that person. So I think the first thing we need to do is be really, really clear that we have to organize across who it is that we think of as our frontline international folks, which in many cases means that students who are thinking about themselves as in terms of like the EVIS system have to realize that they are building solidarity with DACA folks, because from ICE's perspective, we all got A numbers. As I mentioned before, I'm really into working within and then beyond the system. So what I personally did at UC San Diego was found a way to take that template of what do we call public spaces, what do we call non-public spaces, and we actually went through in all of the places that I am affiliated with and found all of the doors that could lock, named them non-public, put out a memo that said, no, you do not have to open the door for anybody, whether they are actually ICE or not. And what we have set up is a system that goes through general counsel, our legal folks, that basically says like, I don't have to open up the door for anybody. I'm just a little ooh-woo like staff member. You're gonna have to PDF that and send it to warrantquestions@ucsd.edu. And in the meantime, we've been identifying like where are points of exit that folks can have while people like me stand in front of the door. And then in addition to that, I dropped in the chat a link tree where we're putting together resources for folks that are like people who are willing to move beyond what the university is going to give us. And last but not least, I think a lot of us are also thinking about things like angel funds, deportation defense. People like me, unfortunately, have experience with that. We had UW undergraduate students in detention during the first Trump administration. So let's build out those connections, let's support each other and move across that, sometimes that university, non-university bias to think about people who know this work well.
Thank you so much. Any last words? What does courage mean for folks right now? The chat has so many beautiful examples of the ways that you all are showing up. So we will make sure to keep it. It's beautiful to see you all taking action in your own ways and finding that within yourselves. From our panelists, any last thoughts before we begin to close out?
I would just add that we all need the courage to think differently about the university and to think about how we start the process of envisioning and making real a university we want that addresses social equity and really a transfer of resources towards the communities that we claim to serve. And I just think that is a bold call, and it takes a lot of us to do that. It's a collaborative effort. So I hope we all have the courage to do that as we resist in this moment.
Amazing. Thank you. We have 3 more minutes. So we're gonna let Tenjiwe McHarris, who's our executive director here at SSJ, take over and close us out.
Thank you, Saudi. Just want to express my appreciation to you, Saudi, but also Megan, Deo, and Devarian for just your insights, and also the way in which you have chosen in this moment to continue to step into courage. You offer your insights here on this session, but we all know every day you are making decisions that are courageous, and also are essentially saying to us in the world that you're choosing to stand on the right side of history. And also want to appreciate all of you for joining. And I just want to say, we know that this moment is for some painful. For some folks may feel angry, outraged, frustrated. We know that we're living in a really troubling time in history. And so to ignore that doesn't do us any favors. And so as we understand all of that, we also know that this is also a defining moment. This is a moment where in some ways we actually also get to break free from something. We get to renew our commitment and our understanding that we have a political and a moral responsibility to build something new. As folks were saying, the thing that got us here, what paved the way to the threats that we're facing now, is not what's going to save us, nor is it what we should be fighting for. And so we get to be bold, we get to be powerful, we get to be loud, and we get to build what we know our communities and our people deserve. And as Devarian said earlier, this is not just something that we build that happens decades down the road. We know real change takes time, but we also get to practice it every day with each other, with our communities. And so for us, a call to courage is for us to step into our full humanity, to be honest with ourselves about what we deserve, what our communities, what our people deserve, and for us to move towards a vision of liberation, of truth, of love, of respect, of kindness and goodness that we know is possible. And so this is a moment where, again, it's going to be painful, it's going to be challenging, but it will also be profoundly courageous. It will also be a very beautiful moment in history. And we are so honored at SSJ that we get to do that alongside all of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Tenjiwe. We do have more events here with SSJ. We have programming all the way until May, so please be sure to check us out. We're so thankful to everybody on this call, to our panelists, to AAUP for helping us organize the back end, and to a National Day of Action for Higher Ed. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you out there.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to end the panel now. Have a good one.